Get lost. You're wasting everyone's time pretending you deserve a spot here. They only accepted you because of your dad, not because you earned it. Candidate Liam Carver made sure everyone heard him when he trapped her outside Battalion HQ, making all 40 officer candidates witness him shove her hard enough that she staggered. He wanted her to break. He wanted the tears. What he didn't realize was that the woman he was trying to intimidate had spent 6 brutal years launching direct-action missions across Iraq and Syria, with more rounds fired in anger than his entire class would ever see. The narrow scar slicing through her left eyebrow wasn't some training mishap, it came from a breaching charge gone wrong in Mosul, metal spraying when she was stacked on a door under fire. When she steadied herself and stared back at him with that cold, empty look of someone who had watched friends bleed out, Carver had already crossed a line most careers never recover from. Some people you push once, this one was about to give a lesson nobody asked for. Officer Candidate School at Fort Ridgeline Training Center lay under a miserable November drizzle, gray skies weighing down the precise brick buildings while wet pine and diesel fumes mixed with the nerves of Week 1 trainees. Across the parade deck, drill instructors shredded a fresh formation, voices slicing through rain like razor blades. First Lieutenant Kara Holt stood outside the headquarters at parade rest, 29 years old, 5 feet 8 inches, dressed in camis that looked suspiciously new for someone like her. Sharp features, short dark blonde hair skimming her collar, the stillness of a person who'd learned long ago that unnecessary movement gets you seen. Her hands told their own stories, small scars from explosive breaches, a thick mark across her palm from a blade that slipped, and calluses shaped by rifles and demo charges. You're watching Major Tom's Tales, and some truths only show up when everything else is stripped away. Hit subscribe, because what happens next will change the way you think about leadership. The scar over her brow was clean but unmistakable, earned when that charge overcut the metal and blasted copper fragments back through the breach point. She'd pushed through the blood and the concussion because stopping wasn't an option. Colonel Dana Mercer, the OCS commanding officer, had combed through Holt's record 4 separate times before signing off on this assignment. 29 was unusually young for an exchange instructor, but the Marine Corps insisted on someone from Naval Special Warfare with real recent combat to evaluate their officer program. What the paperwork didn't reveal was that Holt would be blending in quietly as a staff observer for her first week, her background hidden to see how the school handled a stranger in their ranks. None of the officer candidates had any clue who she really was, and that secrecy was by design. Her brief was simple: blend into the company, keep her head down, show up for PT and inspections like everyone else, and never correct anyone who assumed she lacked experience. Liam Carver took notice of her the very first day. At 24 years old and 6 feet 2 inches, fresh from the Naval Academy with a Marine commission, he carried that polished confidence that comes from never failing at anything that truly matters. A distinguished Annapolis graduate, winner of leadership awards, he lived by the belief that officers weren't shaped, they were born superior, destined to command those who needed direction. When he saw Kara Holt standing quietly among the staff observers, head lowered, movements cautious like she wasn't sure of herself, he saw exactly the weakness she wanted him to see. And he immediately decided she was someone who needed correction. Kara Holt grew up in Port Haven, Florida, daughter of a Navy SEAL she never got the chance to know. Commander Owen Holt died in a helicopter insertion gone wrong in 2001, mechanical failure at low altitude turned a routine mission into a fatal crash. Kara was only 18 months old. Her father lived for her only in framed photographs, a shadow box holding his trident and medals, and the stories passed down from teammates who swore he was the best among them. Her mother, Linda Holt, never remarried. Working as a nurse at the Naval Hospital, she raised her daughter alone and taught her one rule: being a Holt meant finishing what you started, pushing through when things got hard, and earning respect through action, not by demanding it. Kara enlisted in the Navy at 19, not to copy her father, but to learn what kind of job was worth dying for. Boot camp, then hull technician school. 3 years aboard a guided missile destroyer taught her the guts of a warship, from engine rooms to damage control, and she proved she could solve technical problems that left others frustrated. But she wanted more. She applied for BUD/S. Her first attempt fell short. She survived Hell Week but panicked during a deep dive when a gear malfunction hit at the worst possible moment. The instructors dropped her, told her failing was more common than success, and that there was no shame in trying. She waited almost a year and went back, this time making it through. She graduated at 24, one of just 13 survivors out of an original class of 43. At 25, she deployed to Iraq as a breacher and combat engineer on SEAL Team 3, doing a combat job women weren't officially allowed to do back then, but did anyway. Mosul in 2017 changed her forever. Intelligence pointed to an ISIS bomb-making cell in an industrial block. They needed that steel door open, so Kara said a linear charge meant to shear the hinges clean. It cut too deep, molten copper and metal fragments blasted through the wall. Chief Eric Nolan, stacked right behind the breach point, took shrapnel that cracked his plate but didn't get through. A piece slashed across Kara's eyebrow, leaving a 3-inch cut and a concussion so bad she vomited twice while clearing the next rooms. They finished the raid and pulled enough materials to prevent attacks that could have killed hundreds, but she never forgot how close she came to killing Nolan because she'd misjudged by 2 inches. Nolan later told her breaching was part science, part instinct, and the only operators who never screw up are the ones who never leave the wire. Growth meant understanding failure, fixing it, and pushing forward anyway. She went back out, 2 more deployments, over 200 missions across Iraq and Syria, before stepping away from operational teams at 28 to teach advanced tactics at the Naval Special Warfare Center. When the Marine Corps asked for an NSW exchange instructor to support their OCS program, Kara Holt volunteered, not because she wanted to relive firefights through teaching, but because she believed future officers needed to learn that leadership meant taking care of your people, not flexing authority over them. Her father had died in a training accident that never should have happened. Chief Eric Nolan had almost died because she miscalculated a breaching charge. Helping others avoid those failures felt like the only mission that actually mattered now. Meanwhile, candidate Liam Carver ran Class Echo 125 the same way he'd dominated every competitive environment in his life, establish the hierarchy, stay on top, and apply pressure to anyone below. He wasn't technically the class commander, since that role rotated weekly, but everyone instinctively looked to him. He was tall, sharp, confident, and absolutely convinced that his judgment was superior to everyone else's. No one challenged him because doing so seemed pointless. When Colonel Dana Mercer announced that several staff observers would be rotating through the company, including a Navy lieutenant from Naval Special Warfare, Carver evaluated them immediately, like analyzing pieces on a chessboard. Most looked solid, prior platoon commanders, seasoned enlisted Marines turned officers. Then there was Holt. She seemed unsure, walked like she was unfamiliar with Marine discipline. During Mercer's intro, when she mentioned Holt was part of an inter-service exchange program, Carver focused more on what wasn't said. In his mind, that meant Holt had to be some admin type or logistics officer, certainly not someone who'd kick down doors in combat. He decided to test that assumption. Monday afternoon PT was a typical Marine 6-mile formation run followed by pull-ups, crunches, and the combat fitness test. Carver set a brutal pace to see who would fall out. Most staff observers kept up fine. Holt ran mid-formation, steady, controlled, unremarkable. During the barracks inspection afterward, Carver noticed her boots, naval-issue desert style instead of the Marine pattern. He called her out in front of the entire company, asking if she'd even bothered to read the uniform manual, and reminded her that attention to detail starts with the basics. Holt simply agreed and said she'd fix it by the next inspection. No excuses, no irritation, just calm acknowledgement. That calmness annoyed him more than defiance ever could. So he pushed harder as the week continued. He picked apart her performance. Her rack lacked Marine corners, her range tempo was technically sound but too slow, and her leadership essays didn't show the decisiveness he expected. Every critique happened publicly, broadcast to the entire company so the narrative became clear: Lieutenant Holt didn't measure up. Soon other candidates echoed him, tossing around comments about Navy officers not understanding Marine culture, offering her polite disrespect that cut deeper than open insults. Gunnery Sergeant Tom Reyes, the senior enlisted advisor, watched the situation develop with a veteran's unease. 22 years in the Corps, including tours in Fallujah, Sanjin, and Marja, had given him a sharp eye for when maintaining standards crossed into hazing. He finally pulled Carver aside after Thursday's inspection and laid it out: staff observers were not training props. Carver insisted he wasn't targeting anyone, he was just upholding standards. If Lieutenant Holt couldn't handle simple criticism, how could she possibly survive in a real fleet billet where performance actually counted? Gunnery Sergeant Reyes then asked if he'd even looked at her service record before making those judgments. Carver claimed he didn't need paperwork, he could judge competence by watching someone in action. Friday morning brought the weekly land navigation test, timed movements through the training grounds around Fort Ridgeline, pairs using map and compass to find 5 checkpoints spread over 15 square kilometers of rugged terrain. Accuracy and smart decisions under pressure would determine their score. Carver volunteered to team up with Holt, calling it inter-service mentorship. Colonel Mercer approved it without any reaction. Reyes watched that pairing form and felt a familiar heaviness settle in his chest. He'd seen men like Carver before, leaders who proved their worth by spotlighting others' weaknesses. And he'd seen people like Holt too, quiet professionals carrying experiences they never talked about. What Reyes couldn't predict was that Carver had just partnered himself with someone who'd navigated kill zones in Mosul and Raqqa, someone who'd pinned infiltration routes under fire, someone who'd made map errors with real body bags at stake. He was about to get a lesson no one scheduled. The night before the exam, Holt sat alone in her temporary quarters studying contour lines and terrain features, questioning again why she'd taken this assignment. The week had played out exactly as she expected: candidates finding the pecking order, testing boundaries, deciding who fit and who didn't. That was normal. Harsh sometimes, but normal. Carver had pushed it further. He wasn't assessing her capability, he was deliberately undermining her, wanting humiliation instead of growth. She recognized the pattern instantly. He needed someone beneath him to stay on top. And what bothered her wasn't how he treated her. She'd endured far worse from people who had actually earned the right to critique her. What bothered her was the message 40 future officers were absorbing, thinking dominance equals leadership, believing strength comes from making others look small. Her fingers brushed the scar over her brow, a reflex she couldn't break. She could still see Chief Nolan's face after that breach in Mosul, not angry, not blaming, just that silent exhaustion of someone who narrowly survived because of another person's mistake. He had told her failure was information you learned from, not a label you wore. The only ones who never messed up were the ones too scared to attempt anything real. Carver had likely never experienced that level of consequence. People like him avoided scenarios that revealed weaknesses. They stayed safe while pretending to be strong. Tomorrow would expose the truth. Carver thought pairing with her would make her shortcomings obvious: he'd lead, she'd struggle, and everyone would see she didn't belong. But he had no idea she'd spent months in Syrian desert navigating with half-functional maps and zero GPS. No idea she'd plotted Overwatch routes through cities where one wrong turn meant dead teammates. She could absolutely crush him tomorrow. Make his flaws impossible to ignore. Watch his certainty evaporate. But that wasn't why she was here. She was here because the Marine Corps needed officers who understood that leadership was about lifting others up, not crushing them. Putting Liam Carver in his place wouldn't teach him anything beyond the fact that he'd picked the wrong person to bully. If she wanted to help him grow, she needed a smarter approach. Holt snapped her map case shut and prepared, not to win, but to teach. The land navigation course kicked off at 0530 on Friday. 40 candidates and 4 staff observers moved out across Fort Ridgeline's wooded terrain, each pair holding coordinates for 5 checkpoints spread over 15 square kilometers of ridges, valleys, and narrow trails, with only 4 hours to finish. Carver grabbed their map, compass, and grid sheet like a man who believed failure was a myth. Top of his navigation class, professional competence trophy, he treated land nav like something he'd already mastered. He unfolded the map on a truck hood, plotted every point, planned the fastest route, and never once asked Holt's input. She stood by silently. When he finally looked at her, he asked if she needed a walkthrough or if she could keep up. She said she could follow just fine. They stepped out at 0545, Carver driving the pace through the tree line toward checkpoint 1, 3 kilometers out. Cold morning, soaking ground, low clouds threatening more rain. Carver navigated by the book, perfect bearings, a sharp pace count, clean terrain association. They hit checkpoint 1 in 32 minutes, ahead of the curve. Tapping the card, he pushed instantly toward checkpoint 2. Holt politely asked if he'd like her to take a leg. He brushed it off, "I've got it." Checkpoint 2 required crossing a creek valley. On the map, it looked simple. On the ground, not so much. The water ran deeper than the contour suggested, banks steep and slick, vegetation thick enough to choke visibility. Carver chose the shortest crossing and charged straight in, even when it was chest deep and strong enough to drag at their legs. Holt mentioned a better crossing 200 meters down, fallen tree, easy balance, but Carver insisted his route was faster. They reached the second marker 56 minutes in, drenched and shivering but still on schedule. His confidence stayed rock solid. Checkpoint 3 changed that. The point sat beyond a nasty ridge with a 40-degree incline. Either climb straight up, or take a longer firebreak route. Carver chose the direct assault, shorter distance, more efficient, fueled by ego and muscle. Halfway up, the slope turned to slick dust, roots ripped free in their hands, progress dropping to a crawl. Holt stopped and calmly called up that the firebreak would save time overall. Carver replied that she could keep up or wait. So she waited. 23 brutal minutes later, Carver topped out breathing hard, only to realize the checkpoint wasn't there. It was 300 meters down the far side through thick underbrush. Their 40-minute estimate had ballooned into 71. When he finally crashed into the marker clearing, Holt was already there, casually checking her watch. She hadn't sprinted. She hadn't taken shortcuts. She'd simply chosen the smart route while he committed to the dumb one. Confusion flickered across his face, then disbelief. How did she beat him? Holt pointed to the map, explaining in a calm, almost instructional tone that terrain difficulty outranks straight-line distance, that contour spacing reveals where slopes turn punishing, and vegetation symbols show where undergrowth slows you to a crawl. Real efficiency came from reading the ground properly, not muscling your way through every obstacle. Carver's face flickered from surprise, to confusion, then anger, until something like embarrassment finally set in. He'd just been outperformed by the very woman he'd spent days treating like a liability. For the first time, he asked her where she learned to navigate like that. Kara Holt told him plainly she'd spent 6 years with naval special warfare in Iraq and Syria, plotting infiltration routes through hostile streets where a wrong turn didn't cost time, it cost lives. She said she'd made every mistake possible in places where mistakes were final. Carver had no answer. 2 checkpoints left, 107 minutes to finish. Holt suggested splitting up, he'd take checkpoint 4, she'd take 5, then regroup at the finish. Parallel movement would save precious time. Carver agreed instantly. They crossed the line at 3 hours and 48 minutes. 4th place overall. Not a win, but absolutely respectable. On the walk back, Carver finally asked why she never mentioned her background. Holt replied that she wasn't here to impress anyone or wave around her resume. She was here to observe how future leaders developed, and true competence never needed to announce itself. It showed up when required. The afternoon debrief gathered all 40 candidates and the observers. Colonel Mercer reviewed results, pointing out smart decisions and calling out errors that slowed teams down. When she got to Team Carver-Holt, she noted their fourth-place finish and asked Carver to explain their approach. He stood and gave a clean, professional breakdown of their route, openly admitting his poor terrain selection nearly tanked them. Then he did something no one expected. He credited Holt with spotting his mistakes early and offering corrections that kept them from falling apart. Colonel Mercer asked Holt if she had anything to add. Holt replied that the course was well designed to stress both navigation ability and judgment, and that Carver had demonstrated solid compass skills and pacing. His challenge, she said, was being too confident in the first plan he saw, committing before considering alternatives. She paused, then added that in her operational experience, the best navigators weren't the ones who never slipped up, they were the ones who caught mistakes fast enough to prevent disaster. Mercer raised an eyebrow and asked what operational experience she meant. Holt answered calmly, 6 years with naval special warfare, direct action missions in Iraq and Syria, navigating through Mosul and Raqqa when wrong assumptions didn't just hurt pride, they filled coffins. The room froze. Carver stood there, face draining as reality hit. He'd spent all week belittling someone with more combat hours than he might ever accumulate. Someone for whom his hardest training day would have been just a warm-up. Mercer then asked why Holt hadn't shared that background sooner. Holt replied that her mission was to watch how the school handled unfamiliar personnel, and you only see genuine leadership when people believe no one important is paying attention. People revealed who they truly were when they thought no one with authority was paying attention. Holt explained that her job wasn't to catch people messing up, it was to understand what kinds of mistakes the system unintentionally rewarded. Then she looked straight at Liam Carver and told him what she'd seen, a candidate with impressive tactical skills, strong physical performance, and real leadership potential, but also someone who confused control with leadership. Someone who needed others to fall short so he could feel like he stood taller. Someone who hadn't learned yet that great officers raise everyone around them instead of pushing others down to elevate themselves. Carver tried to respond, once, then again, but no words landed. Finally, he managed to ask why she let him treat her like that all week if she could have shut it down at any moment. Holt said simple confrontation wouldn't have taught him anything. He needed to experience firsthand that competence often hides behind quiet professionalism, and that assuming weakness can be dangerous. Leadership required humility about what you didn't know. She pointed out that his mistakes that morning, forcing the creek crossing, choosing the steep ridge, were the same errors junior officers make in real operations. In training, that kind of thing only wastes time. In combat, people die. Gunnery Sergeant Reyes, watching from the back, saw something in Carver fracture, not his future, but his certainty. That absolute belief that he already had everything figured out. Colonel Mercer dismissed the formation. Candidates filed out in near silence, processing what they had just witnessed. A few approached Holt hesitantly, curious now, asking about naval special warfare, about deployments, about how someone even chooses that life. Carver didn't move. He sat there alone, staring ahead, beginning the painful process of rebuilding his entire understanding of leadership. It took him 3 days to ask for a conversation. They met outside battalion headquarters early Monday morning, a sharp wind carrying the cold bite of coming snow. Carver looked drained. He didn't apologize, he wasn't that kind of person, but he admitted his arrogance had blinded him. His identity relied on being better than everyone, and meeting someone who outclassed him quietly and completely had shaken the foundation of who he thought he was. Holt listened patiently. When he finished, she told him about Mosul, how her breaching charge had cut too deep, how she nearly killed Chief Nolan because she'd trusted her math more than caution, how that mistake still lived with her. Confidence mattered, she said, but overconfidence could kill. Leaders must always question themselves, especially when they're sure they're right. Holt told him that confidence was vital for any leader, but deadly if it stopped you from questioning your own assumptions. The best operators she'd ever served with stayed humble enough to keep learning, treating every mission as if the next mistake could finally be the one that mattered. Carver asked quietly if she thought he could still recover as a leader. She answered that it depended entirely on what he chose to take away from this. The following week, Colonel Mercer sent her assessment to Naval Special Warfare Command. Her review was blunt. Fort Ridgeline's OCS produced technically sharp officers with solid fundamentals, but many still needed a shift in leadership philosophy, moving away from dominance and toward genuine competence and accountability. She recommended bringing in more instructors from unconventional backgrounds, people who had proved themselves in places nobody advertised. Liam Carver graduated 7 weeks later, middle of the class instead of at the top, and received orders to the 2nd Marine Division at Camp Lejeune. Gunnery Sergeant Reyes pulled him aside before he left and told him that in those final weeks, he'd actually led better, more teamwork, more honesty when he wasn't sure, more focus on helping his classmates instead of beating them. Whether he'd learned enough? Time would decide. Kara Holt returned to the Naval Special Warfare Center in Port Haven, back to training operators who already knew that skill can fade fast, but humility has to be permanent. On her desk sat her father's shadow box, Commander Owen Holt, dress blues sharp, his trident shining in the glass, eyes full of confidence from a time before one mistake changed everything. Some people spent their lives trying to live up to a legacy they were handed. Kara had chosen a different mission, making sure the next generation of warriors stayed alive long enough to build legacies of their own.